Connections Radio presents.
Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm your host, Ian Kelly. And on this edition of Vegas Hockey Hub, we're going to be doing something a little bit different here on this episode. As you know, we've had a very interesting off season. We've had, a couple of months to really think over what happened with the Stanley Cup a few months back. But an interesting topic came up. And this is really what the dialogue of this episode is going to be about. As over the last 5 seasons in the NHL, there has been a certain state that has taken over the NHL. And more importantly, there has been 2 teams that have been the peak, the best of the best in the NHL. And that's really what this episode is going to be about. And I'm going to give you not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but I'm going to give you 5 reasons as to why the state of Florida took over hockey. And we're going to do all of that on this episode of Vegas Hockey Hub here on PR Connections Radio. Go to the website. We have over a dozen shows on the platform, including this one. So I highly recommend checking that out. We also have our social media as well at Vegas Hockey Hub. We upload every single day. And more importantly, we have live events and stuff that we upload to our social medias at Vegas Hockey Hub. And if you want to follow your host, I'm right down there. And my social medias are at Ian J. Rachele, so IanJRachiele. So this is going to be a really fun episode talking about how Florida took over hockey. And before we kind of establish this, I want to take you back just a little bit. More importantly, I want to take you back to a decade prior. Because a lot of people forget that the state of Florida was at a complete 180 from what it is now. All right, take yourself back to 2014. The Florida Panthers organization hadn't been to a Stanley Cup since the mid-90s, since they lost to the Colorado Avalanche when they had John Van Beesbrook. This was a Florida Panthers team that, had up and downs throughout majority of their franchise. This was a team that dabbled heavily in analytics in the 2010s and ended up abandoning it towards the middle of the end. It went back to kind of more of the traditional style of recruiting out of style when it came to the Florida Panthers organization. Where on the opposite side, you had Tampa Bay. And Tampa Bay, around this time, had just lost in the, they had just lost in the playoffs, so they were building themselves up. They had Steven Stamkos. They had Victor Hedman. There was some good talent. Ben Bishop as goaltender. But the one thing that Tampa Bay did not have, they did not have a situation where they were dominant in the Eastern Conference. This was only year 2 of them being in back-to-back playoff runs. And this was really one of the first times since the mid-2000s when they had Brad Richards, they had Martin St. Louis, when they had Vincent Lecavalier. This was a Tampa Bay team that really seemed like for the first time in a long time were serious contenders for a Stanley Cup championship. And in the rest of that decade, in the rest of the 2010s, Tampa Bay did this and Florida did this. Tampa Bay made it to the Stanley Cup Finals and lost to Chicago Blackhawks during the mid-2010s. John Cooper, yes, was a big part of that, but you also had to give a lot of credit to the front office and to the management and executives that were around there. Let's also not forget, this is a Tampa Bay Lightning team that ended up having the President's Trophy and losing in the first round and getting swept by the Columbus Blue Jackets. This was an organization that just really seemed like they were, on an upward trajectory, but they kind of, faltered when the playoffs happened. On the other hand, you had Florida. And this was a Florida team that was kind of, just first round exit, barely missing the playoffs. They dove heavily into analytics. That's when they went out and got Anton Stroman. That's when they went out and got guys like Keith Yandel. This was a Florida team that went so heavily into analytics and then almost blew the entire thing up 3 years later. And that's when they had Riley Smith. It's when they had Jonathan Marchessault. I mean, this is when they had, Jacob Markstrom, and then, had Roberto Luongo. He came back to Florida towards the end of his career. I mean, this was two tales here between Florida and Tampa Bay. But how did Florida end up being successful? How did Tampa Bay finally win a championship? Well, the way that Tampa Bay and Florida both did this is that they ended up picking the right person to be in charge. And reason one of how Florida took over hockey was they picked the right GM. Let's not forget that the Tampa Bay Lightning had Steve Yzerman at the helm for a decent amount of the time that they were being successful in the NHL. But even when Steve Yzerman left, they ended up promoting the guy underneath him from assistant GM to actual GM, and he just kept it going. And he made solid move after solid move, acquisition and trade and free agent signing. The general manager spot has not been a problem for Tampa Bay for really the last 15 years. Getting the general manager position correctly is what mattered in Tampa Bay. And it was so crucial to how Tampa Bay ended up winning back-to-back Stanley Cups and making it to 3 Stanley Cup finals in a row. Because you had a person at the helm, you had a captain, a person on the bridge, someone who was the leader of the team and someone who was making sure that the right people were in the right spot. So that's how Tampa Bay did what they did. They picked the right general manager, and they did that perfectly. Move over to Florida. And in 2020, after the pandemic, after the 1920 season, after the bubble, Florida brought in Bill Zito to be the general manager. Now, Bill Zito had a well-established career in hockey. He was a former player. He ended up being, in terms of agency, he ended up going over to the Columbus Blue Jackets. He had, something to do with the AHL, the Cleveland Monsters. So Bill Zito was well into the world of hockey. But what Bill Zito did with Florida is that he took over as a general manager after the 1920 season, and he made the right decisions with Florida. He made moves that helped out Florida as a general manager. This was a guy in Bill Zito that ended up acquiring a really good player like Gustav Forsling on waivers. This is someone who went out and acquired a Brandon Montour. This is someone who did the necessary moves in Florida. And in just 4 years, Bill Zito has helped Florida make it to not 1, but 2 Stanley Cup Finals appearances and end up winning that second one, as he just did a few months ago. So picking the right general manager was key for Tampa Bay and was vital to Florida. If Bill Zito is not the general manager in Florida, I highly doubt that they make it to back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals. If you have Steve Yzerman not in Tampa Bay and he had been in Detroit the entire time, could you have imagined that the Tampa Bay success that we've seen for the last 10 years, that would have been happening in Detroit if Ken Holland had stepped down and Steve Yzerman took over like Detroit wanted back in 2008. So, that's step 1. Picking the right general manager was vital for Tampa Bay and for Florida. And on this episode of Vegas Hockey Hub, where we're talking about how the state of Florida took over hockey. The reason one was that both teams picked the right general manager. And the second reason as to why Florida and Tampa Bay ended up making it to a Stanley Cup is because their draft classes and their farm system and the people that they developed and they recruited and they scouted, it mattered to Florida. It mattered to Tampa Bay. Now, I know a lot of people poke fun at our Vegas Golden Knights because we trade away a lot of our draft picks. This is a Vegas Golden Knights team that's had first-round picks traded almost every single year. That's been the joke here in Vegas. I get it. But in Tampa Bay, their first-round picks turned into very successful players during their era. Let's not forget that they drafted first overall their face of the franchise, their captain, Steven Stamkos. Steven Stamkos was a vital piece to why Tampa Bay had been successful for 10 years now. And Steven Stamkos was also helped out by additional first-round picks like a Victor Hedman, who has become a stable and consistent one of the best defensemen and one of the best blue liners in all of hockey today. Victor Hedman's been doing that for years now. He was drafted by Tampa Bay. And then a few years later, they end up going out and getting a goalie in the first round. But my, oh my, you could say there was a stretch of time he was the best goalie in the NHL. And of course, I'm talking about Andrei Vasilevsky. But even going past that, this was a Tampa Bay Lightning organization that went out and they did go and get Nikita Kucherov, who has been a massive piece to why they won back-to-back Stanley Cups. You also had guys like Braden Point, who was developed by Tampa Bay. You also had some very good players like a Mikhail Sergachev, who was also developed by the Tampa Bay Lightning. He started out in Montreal, but he got traded over to Tampa Bay. But that's when he was a prospect. That's when he was a very young guy. He was developed in Tampa Bay. You also, during that run where they were kind of building everything up, you also had Ryan McDonough, who, this was Tampa Bay, New York Rangers, that trade and everything that happened there. But something that also happened around that same time, and something that a lot of people probably don't acknowledge, is that this was a Tampa Bay Lightning team that had some really young guys in the middle six and on their bottom six that ended up becoming very valuable players in Tampa Bay during that time period. And it's just really interesting to see how all those young guys ended up becoming a very good part of that back-to-back Stanley Cup championship team out there in Tampa Bay. Well, let's move over to Florida. Because when it came to Florida's draft classes, the first ever draft class that Bill Zito had, the 2020, 2021 season, that ends, and then you end up having a situation where the Florida Panthers have this influx of young talent. You have a first-round pick like Anton Lundell, who has actually become a very good member of Florida. You also had a young goaltender named Devin Levi, who they ended up trading with a first-round pick for a core piece of Florida's team in Sam Reinhart. So the way Sam Reinhart got to Florida, thanks to Devin Levi and a first-round pick. There's also a team that ended up going out and trading a draft pick and getting Brandon Montour, which was a good, solid part of their defense. He was part of that. You also have to include, when it comes to the Florida Panthers organization, they went out and they used draft capital alongside a top six piece in Jonathan Huberdeau and traded him to Calgary and brought in arguably your face or second face of the franchise in Matthew Tkachuk. So when it came to making draft classes matter, this was a Florida team that took their draft picks and either drafted some guys that were on their middle six or are on the middle or back end of their defensive pairings, or more importantly, they took these draft classes, they took their draft picks, and they traded them and brought in talent like they did with Sam Reinhart, like it did with Matthew Tkachuk. So, when it comes to Tampa Bay and it comes to Florida, reason number 2 of how the state of Florida took over hockey is they made their draft classes matter. They took those draft picks and they turned it into a core piece of their roster. So as we're talking about all of this here on Vegas Hockey Hub with your host Ian Rakelli, I do want to move over to the head coaching position. Because having a top 5 head coach is so key. It is one of the most important jobs you can have in hockey. And having one of the best of the best of the best is a very good indicator that you could be a Stanley Cup champion. Case in point, look at behind us. Bruce Cassidy was a top 5 caliber head coach in the Boston Bruins. They let him go. He comes to Vegas. He wins a Stanley Cup. Why? Because he's a top 5 caliber coach. So, what did Tampa Bay do? And what did Florida do that was so key? The Tampa Bay Lightning had John Cooper. John Cooper is right now the longest tenured head coach in the NHL. And the reason why he's the longest tenured head coach, why he has been around for a decade plus now, is because he is among the best in the NHL. He gets the most out of his players, his system, his style. John Cooper is a major part of why Tampa Bay won back-to-back cups, because the system that he put into place in Tampa Bay helped utilize what Andre Vasilevsky could do in net. What John Cooper did is he took a system and created it to make defensemen become a big developing part of that team. And in terms of the top 6, they did a lot of good in Tampa Bay, and John Cooper's system had a lot to do with that. I'm talking about Braden Point, talking about Nikita Kucherov, I'm talking about Steven Stamkos. This was an organization that even when they had JT Miller before they traded him away, this is a Tampa Bay organization that the system that John Cooper has put into place made them better and turned them into a championship winning organization that they have been the past couple of years. And on the other side, Paul Maurice. Paul Maurice has been a long time head coach in the NHL. He has been doing this for 2+ decades in the National Hockey League. He had been out there in Carolina. He had been in Winnipeg. He had been in a bunch of places before landing in Florida after the scandal in 2021 where Joel Quenneville was dealing with the Chicago Blackhawks situation, the sexual assault situation out there in Chicago. Joel Quenneville was let go. Andrew Brunette came in and they won the President's Trophy. Well, Andrew Brunette, he went over to Nashville and they ended up getting Paul Maurice. And Paul Maurice in the last 2 seasons has helped them get back-to-back Stanley Cup final appearances. Paul Maurice's system and the way that he instructs his team and the way he organizes the roster and the way that he builds up those lines on the forwards, on defense, and in net, Paul Maurice is one of the smartest people in hockey. Paul Maurice has been doing this for a long time, and it was actually kind of nice to see Paul Maurice finally win a Stanley Cup. So for Florida, having a top 5 coach, that mattered. Tampa Bay, having a top 5 coach, that has mattered. And having a top 5 coach, regardless of how you feel about it, having a Bruce Cassidy does matter. Having somebody like a John Cooper matters. Having someone like a Paul Maurice matters. Having a head coach like a Jim Montgomery, does matter. And when you also want to sit there and think about it, when it comes to head coaches, having someone like Jared Bednar does matter. Because at the end of the day, when you want to win a championship, when you want to contend and make the playoffs year in and year out, those are coaches that you rely on. Those are 5 coaches that you can trust to get you to the playoffs every year. And those are 5 coaches that if I was starting an NHL franchise, I am making them my head coach tomorrow. So when it comes to top 5 head coaches, having a top 5 coach is what made Tampa Bay successful and what has made Florida successful. But that's not the only reason. Now, if you are a hockey fan, you have heard this debate over and over again. Does great goaltending make a team, or does great defense make a good goalie? In other words, does a great goaltender help with a good defense, or does a great defense help with a good goalie? Well, both Tampa Bay and both Florida has proven that to have a great goaltender on top of a good defense will make you a Stanley Cup champion. And moving over to Tampa Bay, I briefly talked about him earlier, but Andrei Vasilevskiy had a 3-year stretch where he was the undisputed best goaltender in hockey. Andrei Vasilevskiy proved at the end of the year why he was the best goaltender. His amazing saves, his cool, calm, collective confidence he had in net. Andrei Vasilevskiy would be playing almost every single night in Tampa Bay and earning that paycheck every single game. And when it came to the Stanley Cup Finals, regardless if it was against Montreal, it was against Dallas, it was against Colorado, it didn't matter who the competition was, Andrei Vasilevskiy was on his A++ game when it came to Tampa Bay. And there was a case for a while that Andrei Vasilevskiy had one of the best runs we have seen by a goaltender in recent memory. So for Andrei Vasilevskiy, he was a huge deal and a big part of why Tampa Bay made it to 3 Stanley Cup Finals in a row. And Andrei Vasilevskiy was a huge factor into why Tampa Bay won back-to-back Stanley Cups. Great goaltending was a massive part of it. And then when you move over to Florida, when in free agency, they made that acquisition and they signed Sergei Bobrovsky to that massive deal, there was some backlash originally. A lot of people thought, was this going to pan out? Was this going to be a good move at the end of the day? But what ended up happening is that after some struggles at the beginning, Sergei Bobrovsky earned that paycheck and then some because of his performances the last 2 playoffs. Sergei Bobrovsky was the best player from the Stanley Cup Finals a few months ago. And to me, that shouldn't even be disputed. What Sergei Bobrovsky did in the first 3 games of the Stanley Cup Finals against Edmonton, he performed on his head, on his chest, on his legs, on his equipment, on his feet, on his skates. It didn't matter. Sergei Bobrovsky was making save after save after save. And that is what Sergei Bobrovsky did. And the reason why is because of how great Sergei Bobrovsky has been. It didn't matter if it was out there, when it came to Philadelphia, when it came to Columbus, now when it comes to Florida. Sergei Bobrovsky has been an elite goaltender for a long time now. And funny enough, by the way, to kind of connect this back to it, when Sergei Bobrovsky earned that contract with Florida, who did he beat the prior postseason? Oh yeah, Tampa Bay. So when it comes to great goaltending, Sergei Bobrovsky, big part of that. Andrei Vasilevskiy, definitely a part of it. And that really shows you how valuable great goaltending is. And if you are in that camp of great goaltending helps a good defense win a Stanley Cup. You have two examples right here. So that's reason number 4. Okay, reason number 4 on how Florida took over hockey. How the state of Florida, just 2 teams, ended up winning the Eastern Conference back to back to back to back to back years. 5 consecutive years of the Eastern Conference rolling through the state of Florida. And let me let you in on something, by the way. Heading into 24-25, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I don't think it's done. I really don't think that the state of Florida is done being in the Stanley Cup Finals. Seeing what's coming ahead, these teams still have talented rosters. So do not be surprised if at the end of 24-25, we see Florida make it to it for the 6th time in a row. And if that does happen, that will really show you how incredible Florida and Tampa Bay have been in the state of hockey. And you know what? When it comes to Tampa Bay, when it comes to Florida, I mean, let's just face it. When it comes to the Eastern Conference, over the last 4 seasons, they have been the it factor. I mean, Boston Bruins have been there, I guess. I mean, President's Trophy winner, but like that matters. You know, when it comes to, Boston Bruins, New York Rangers, Carolina Hurricanes, when it comes to some organizations in the Eastern Conference, a lot of people sit there and act like there's been anybody else except Carolina had a chance, they failed. New York Rangers had a chance, they didn't get through. Boston Bruins, they tried to make an attempt, they couldn't get far. You also had a situation where New York Islanders went and tried to make a run, and they couldn't do it. So at the end of the day, the last 5 years, the reason why the Eastern Conference has been in the state of Florida, why the Stanley Cup Finals have been in Florida the last 5 years straight. Well, 4 years straight because of the pandemic. That was in Edmonton. But when it came to the last 4 seasons, you have made stops in Florida for a vital reason. And that reason is because they have had talented rosters, great general managers, excellent goaltending, and they have had a genius and a brilliant mind as head coach. And by the way, reason number 5, and this is the final reason why the state of Florida has taken over hockey. Low risk, high reward moves. This is a Tampa Bay Lightning team that ended up going out and getting some really good players and having them turn out. A person like Nick Paul, who was a middle 6 forward who ended up doing very well for them. You also had a situation where you ended up having someone like Mitchell Stevens, who joined Steve Yzerman out there over in Detroit. You had players for example, you had a Brandon Hagel, who they acquired and locked up long term. That was a trade. That was a low risk, kind of high reward situation kind of move. That happened. You also have ended up having out there in Florida low risk, high reward moves. Gustav Forsling picked up on waivers. You also had Carter Verhaeghe, who was with Tampa Bay and was with them during their cup run. And then he came over to Florida and he's become one of the best players on that team. So overall, when it comes to both of these teams, they made those low risk, high reward moves, and it benefited mightily for them. So this is Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rakelli. And until next time, continue watching hockey, go support junior hockey, and let's go.
PR Connections Radio thanks you for watching this podcast. Check out more episodes of this show and our others at prconnectionsradio.com.